And we're visiting today with Clay Darnell in Marshall County, Kentucky. Most of you know Clay, I imagine, already. He's had, as far as I know, just about a lifetime here, and he served as postmaster at Hardin. He played baseball that I remember having seen him play, and a number of other things. Clay, it's good to see you.
Well, good to have you in the house, Ray.
Would you mind telling us if you're a native of Marshall County?
Yes, sir.
You were born here, and about when was that?
1906.
So you meet our criteria of being 65 years of age.
At least.
All right. To satisfy the genealogists a bit, Clay, tell us who your mother and father were.
My mother was Flora Mathis, and my father, Joe Darnell.
Now, there are lots of Darnells in the county, and perhaps there have been several Joe Darnells. Now, was you the one they call Sheriff Joe?
Well, he was sheriff, yes, sir.
Okay. And how many brothers and sisters did you have, or did you have any?
I had 2 sisters and 3 brothers, family of 6.
Uh-huh. The Darnell family is, some of them I know spell their name A-L-L, which you do, and some put E-L-L to it.
Well, yes, we spell A-double-L.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, do you know anything about any of your grandparents?
Well, I knew my grandfather on the father's side and my grandmother on my mother's side. My grandfather on my mother's side died in about 1912, and my grandmother on my father's side died in about 1913. That could be vice versa. I don't remember for sure.
Right. Where did you go to school, Clay?
Well, of course, I first started at Benton grade school, and then we moved from Benton to the farm out here in 1918, and I then went to school at Union Hill.
Union Hill. Well, I remember that, being around that area. Was Peggy Ann Spring there then?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It's kind of, at least when I was a boy, sort of a center for people to go and have a good time on Sunday. And Mr. Redden sold some cold drinks, which were rare to me.
Yeah.
And you could swim for a dime, as I remember.
Well, that's possibly right.
I never got to go very often, but once in a while we did. And do you remember any of your teachers?
Well, the only teacher I remember in grade school at Benton was Nell Ely Washburn, Dr. Washburn's wife.
Well, she lived next door to me for some years
right?
in Benton, so I knew her.
Yeah.
She had a son who's a physician, I believe, in New Orleans, if I'm remembering that correctly. Lawrence Lee.
I think that's right. I didn't know her family very well.
Well, what was Benton School like when you were going there? Was it in that same spot?
Yeah, same spot.
Did they, what kind of games did you get to play?
Well, at Benton?
Uh-huh. Typical hopscotch?
Hopscotch, and I think we called it Wolf Over the River, which was similar to Come Through. Maybe the same thing.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I remember that game, too, and you don't often hear anyone say anything about it.
No.
Yeah, Wolf Over the River, sheep meat and no liver.
Yeah.
Why we said that, I don't quite know, but...
I don't either.
And you, let's see, if I recall, you had a line of students with their arms locked together, and then the wolf tried to run and break through.
Well,
Is that the way it went? Or?
I'm not sure.
something like that.
It could be. I don't remember
If you could break
that.
through, you'd scored a point, I
Oh,
guess,
yeah.
and if you couldn't, why, you were whipped. You weren't a wolf. Yeah. All right. Do you remember whether you had any particular problems with a teacher or not? Did you ever have to put your nose in the ring, or?
No, I've had to stand up, and I've had to write the multiplication table
A few times.
a few times.
Okay. All right. Now, as you grew up and became a young man, could you tell us something about what courting was like back then? Did you start out pretty young with the girls? Or?
Well, not too young. I was a little bit shy, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Your big joy at that time was that baseball?
Yeah, after I become a teenager. In fact, in 1921, I had a typhoid fever all one summer. And then after that, I began to play baseball. And I own a sort of a funny thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I made the first team at Hardin, I hit a ball down there in the old school, right at the front door.
Uh-huh.
And at that time, we wore supporters on our socks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I hit that ball, and my supporter came loose when I got to first base, and I stopped and fixed that, which would have been an easy double had I run it out.
Uh-huh. Yeah. You
But
wanted
I was embarrassed.
Yeah. You wanted to make sure everything was just
That's
right
right.
for you.
No uniforms, of course.
Uh-huh.
Overalls, I guess.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, that's interesting. I've seen you play at Hardin. Of course, it was in somewhat later years than that. But how old were you when you quit playing baseball?
The last game I played, I was 45.
Well, that's that ties the record, or perhaps beats the one. I remember a fellow that they used to call Old Aches and Pains for the Chicago White Sox, a player named Luke Appling.
Yeah.
And I believe he played till he was 44 or 45, along there somewhere.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
I was too old, I'll admit that.
But you could still hit a ball.
Well, I was pretty fortunate I was able to hit, but that's about all.
Well, tell us a little more about your baseball. Did you ever go away from here and play somewhere else?
Well, other than I went to Dawson Springs and played for a company up there.
Uh-huh.
2 different seasons, I believe. And one year we won was called a Tri-State.
Mm-hmm.
We played a team from St. Charles, Missouri, and won, and represented Kentucky and Illinois at Battle Creek, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, amateur or
Semi-pro.
semi-pro.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But we didn't do any good. There's a bunch of country boys went to town.
Yeah, well, I was reading in the paper a week or so ago, Clay, where John Clay Darnell, Lovett, was talking about various things in Marshall County history, and he mentioned among the great baseball players he knew, Clay Darnell was one of them, I recall.
Yeah, John Lovett was a good fan.
Yeah. Well, would you care to comment on some of the better baseball players you've seen around Marshall County?
Well,
We won't ask you to name yourself, but
well, I would say that Tiger Hayne was
one of the better pitchers.
One of the
wasn't
better pitchers, yes, sir.
Mhm.
And of course, Edgar Hawley later went to the major league.
Uh-huh.
And there was a left-hander back in his time named Paul Cooper, a left-hander, lived at Benton.
Yeah.
And then, of course, at Benton, before I started playing, was Glenn Ely and Bus Creason, Thomas Morgan, Tellis Black.
All were good baseball players.
That's right. And then, of course, in my time, Burnett Holland was finishing his career about the time I started, but he was still a good ball player.
Mm-hmm.
Edgar Height, Jim Ed Cross, Weldon Jones, Eli Creason,
Well, you've brought
Matt
up.
Sparkman.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And
He was with the school system.
that's right.
When I started teaching at Murray State, he was there.
Yeah,
And of course, he still lives in Murray.
yeah. Nice fella. Very good friend.
Well, that's wonderful. You've given us enough names there that somebody ought to have their memory stirred this morning.
Oh, yeah.
So that's
There's others. George Cub, Charlie Ray Pugh. Well, they're a little bit younger than
now. Most people think that the first football ever played in Marshall County was at North Marshall, and then shortly thereafter, when the new high school opened in the fall of '74, of course, we began playing for Marshall County High, the Marshalls. But now I've heard a rumor that there was football played in the county before that. Could you tell us anything you might know about it?
Well, it was at Benton. Now, before my time, before I played, there were people like Joe Lovett and Gip Watkins, Thomas Morgan, Bus Creason, Glenn Ely, Scott Ely, others, but I don't recall their names right now.
My father-in-law, Ezra Blumenberg, once said that he went to high school about that time. Of course, came from out of the country.
Yeah.
And he said that the first football game he ever saw, he played in it.
Well,
The coach they needed a hand, and
Yeah.
he said, you get in there and do so-and-so, and I did, and that's the first game I'd ever seen.
Well, football's quite a lot different from then and now.
Well, they have a coach for every position.
Yeah. Well, and teams then played both defense and offense.
Uh-huh.
I imagine if they had 15 players,
They thought
that's
they
an
were,
exception.
yeah. Yeah. Well, did you play with that group?
No, I played
Now,
later.
what group were you playing with?
Well, that with Jim Ed Cross, Barnett Ely, Bill Nelson, Bill Roll, well, let's see, Jake Smith, Parvin Myers, Lester Tauber, Ed and Van Thomas, Robert Shamwell. That's all I can think of.
Good. That's a big list. Maybe it was Pont Nelson along about
Pont Nelson,
Yeah.
yes.
along about that time too. Well, I suppose that's enough about early day football. And we won't ask you what your record was. I asked my father-in-law one time, and he said, well, he didn't remember what it was. And but they did have some great games. In fact, there were teams that had been in it a long time that naturally, I guess, were better than Benton, like Mayfield and Paducah
Yeah,
Tillman.
Mayfield
and
has swamped us bad.
Yeah.
They had one of their better teams.
All right, now then that you were up to a teenager and a young man, you did marry,
Yes, sir.
and your wife is,
Agnes Gardner.
and do you have any children, Clay?
2. Girl and a boy. Anita Clay Darnell and Lynn Gardner Darnell.
Now, Lynn Gardner I see about every week at church at Benton, and so he lives right around Benton somewhere. I noticed Anita Clay has a young son who is now director of placement at Murray State University.
That's right. Just recently.
So I guess you're proud of him. And do you have any other grandchildren?
Yeah, he has a sister, Cheryl, living in Evansville, and Lynn has 3 boys, all 3 now in Murray.
Well, I know Curtis,
Curtis.
but I don't guess I
And
know the others real
Gregory's,
well.
Gregory is the middle boy, and Brian just started at Murray. This year he's a freshman.
So your grandchildren are near enough to you that you can enjoy it.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine. All right, have you ever been out of the county, Clay, left and say during the Depression years like many of our people go to Detroit and work?
I spent 15 months in Detroit. Oh, in the mid-20s, I don't remember.
Did you work for Ford?
Worked for Ford, yeah.
Nearly everybody that left here and originally
Yeah.
worked for Ford. And of course, they made more cars than everybody else put together at one time.
I would guess so, yes.
Well, did you enjoy the life there, or?
Just like being in jail.
Well, in other words, you wanted to come back to Marshall County.
Yeah, I didn't like it all.
Now, Clay, during World War II, you were, you must have been about 38 or along there somewhere, because weren't you about among the last people ever drafted?
I wasn't drafted.
You weren't drafted.
I went to be examined and passed.
Uh-huh.
But before I was called, they either lowered the age limit or, see, I had 2 children at that time, and that.
Well, at one time they took them all the way to 44, and then
Yeah.
they cut it back.
Well, I was in that cutback. I didn't have to go.
They decided that people 44 years old didn't make good infantry.
I would think not.
No, beginning to get a little bit too stiff to go through that kind of thing. Well, I had forgotten exactly where you went or not, but I thought I remembered you were examined or something.
I went to Evansville and passed my examination. But
All right, when you finally came back from Detroit, what did you do?
I think I went back farming at home with my parents.
What got you interested in the Postal Service? I remember that you were postmaster at Hardin for a good many years, weren't you?
Yeah, 25, a little over.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was operating for Sutler's store at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Donald Hughes retired from the postmaster and went on the rural route as a mail carrier. And the vacancy was bare, and I applied for it. And the fellow who had the say committed himself.
Mm-hmm.
I'll recommend you.
Yeah.
And
So-
come to pass.
Well, good. That was fine. You were back in Kentucky, and you had a steady income, and it was relatively pleasant. You didn't work on Sundays, and so you.
I did.
Oh, you did.
Sunday morning, we met the morning train on Sunday, and we met a 7 o'clock train at night. But in later years, that was all past.
Yeah. Well, you know, I found out something I didn't know. I remember when the trains ran, of course, and I think probably about the last one was, 51 or somewhere in there.
Probably right. I don't remember that.
I have it written down someplace, but I can't remember right offhand. But before that, we had a number of trains each day. But I didn't realize that you had to meet the train on Sunday.
Sunday morning. Yes, sir.
Pick up the mail. Well,
Yeah.
we had better mail service then than we do now, of course,
I'll agree with that.
because, well, there were usually, 2 trains north and 2 trains south every day?
Yes, sir. That's right.
And now there's just one truck, I
Yeah,
believe,
That's right.
each way.
Yeah.
One that goes down and goes back, run from Carbondale down to Murray or somewhere like that. So we had to have better service back in those days than we have now. Well, tell us a little about Benton, as you remember the businesses or anything special that's changed a lot, or.
Well, you've had some people that know more about Benton than I do,
Uh-huh.
but I remember some things that I haven't heard yet.
Well, go ahead and tell us.
Well, where the Valley Loan, it isn't that now.
No. They've changed it to Republic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, E.B. Ferguson had a hardware store there.
I don't believe I've ever heard anyone say that before.
Yes, sir. I heard Woodrow, the first thing he remembered was filling station there.
Uh-huh.
And I talked to him about it, and he didn't remember that. Of course, I'm a little older.
Uh-huh.
And, well, I've heard where Peel and Holland is now, the first I remember, P.B. Son had a butcher shop and a restaurant, I believe.
P.B. Son had a butcher shop.
Yes,
Now, I'm almost positive I've never heard that before.
I haven't heard it mentioned on people like Homer Lucas, which should remember that.
You know, that's an interesting comment on our society. Just the name butcher shop. You don't really see just butcher shops anymore. But back then, it was very common.
That's right. He butchered there in Benton.
Uh-huh.
Oh,
I understand in England they have a butcher shop, and then they have a greengrocer
yeah.
Where you go to buy vegetables and so on. But of course, here in America, the supermarket
Yeah, that's
taking over everything.
That's
yeah.
right. Well, on that west side, I'm killing your time. Mr. Riley had a drugstore. McElrath had a dry goods store. Stroud Brothers had a dry goods store. And then Nelson's drugstore's been there ever since I can remember. Of course, the Bank of Benton joined it.
Mm-hmm.
Boyd Smith had a dry goods store, hardware.
Uh-huh.
Griffith had a dry goods store. And L.T. Potts had a bakery.
Well, I know I've never heard of that. L.T. Potts had a bakery.
Yes, sir. He later moved to someplace in Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, then the Bank of Marshall County.
Yeah.
And where the National Store is, first
Oh, excuse me. Go ahead. The National Store.
was a hotel, the first I remember.
Yeah.
Ms. Belle King Sullivan, which was George Long's stepmother, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And after the courthouse burned, my father's sheriff at the time, and he had his office temporarily there in that old hotel.
Yeah.
And then of course, on the south side, John Peterson had a hardware store. And nearly most of the east of that was where he stored buggies, wagons,
Mm-hmm.
and on up further, Castleberry Brothers had a dry goods store. Dykers had they sold mostly Christmas things. That's where you wanted to visit when you was a kid, at Christmas time.
Yeah.
And J.R. Brandon had on the corner. Warfield Beck Can was a livery stable.
You could rent a horse and buggy or
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
And they sold and traded horses. And then there was a hotel on the east side, and that's about as far as I can go, except where the Bank of Marshall County is. I think there was a frame building there, I think was once Cross operated the newspaper.
Mm-hmm. The
Benton
Tribune.
Yeah. And then, of course, the Methodist Church and Solon Palmer
Uh-huh.
on the north side. And
Well, you've just boxed the compass. You've gone all the way around.
some of them I've left
Uh-huh.
out.
Well,
I
you
remember.
may have, but it sounds to me as certainly you knew more than any other person I've ever interviewed, Clay,
Well,
about that generation.
I'm sure that people in Benton, Homer Lucas has been there practically all his life, and other people I'm sure can fill in some vacant places there.
Do you excuse me, do you have something else you'd like to say? We've
Well-
got about another minute and a half.
Other than where the Church of Christ parking lot is was a livery stable,
Oh,
and Tom Vaughn operated a horse-drawn bus from the depot to town. He'd meet the trains.
uh-huh.
That has stuck in my memory.
Well, naturally it would. Do you remember what Raleigh James Jackson said about a big gully being along?
Oh yeah,
That's the first time I'd heard that when he told it.
on the on the main street, which is the south street now.
Uh-huh.
On the west side of the road, there was a ditch there, and Boy Ford, which is a colored man, lived down there, and Mr. Leigh Hyatt, which is Ed Hyatt's father, had a footbridge across that ditch.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there's a big sewer there now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Clay. Do you have any last bit of
Well-
wisdom you'd like to give us?
No,
Well,
nothing more.
I certainly appreciate visiting in the home of Clay Darnell near Hardin, and I know you've enjoyed the interview also. This is Oral History with Ray Mofield. Now back to our studio.